All right, a really warm welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this session on strengthening agroecological resilience in the city. This, of course, is part of the Agroecological City Conference. So as we get started, I invite you to continue sharing where in the world you're coming from. And we'd also love to know something about how you engage in urban agroecology. And so I hope you've been inspired and moved by speakers and conversations during other sessions. And we also just want to invite you to join us tomorrow for the closing session. That's from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. During that time, we hope to kind of collectively consider what we've learned and also collectively consider what next steps could be. In particular, the possibility of forming a collaborative focused on urban agroecology in the Bay Area. And so, but today we are going to hear from 9 speakers who will be sharing their insights and experiences for how to build agroecological resilience, from how we steward soils and insects to managing fire risks, to how to improve food access and distribution, including food access and distribution over the course of the pandemic. And so part of the motivation for this session is to share out what was learned over the last 3 years of a research project led by an interdisciplinary team at UC Berkeley and also led by partners from the Bay Area community. This project was focused both on ecological aspects of food production and also different models for economic viability of urban farms and food access and distribution. And so we've also gone beyond this core research project to invite perspectives today on things like the ever-growing risks of wildfires and the ongoing impacts of the pandemic on food insecurity. And so our host today is going to be just sent out, or will send out a link to everybody's bios that you can check out, so that you can learn a little bit more about them. And so I want to just talk for a minute about resilience. You know, it's a term that's getting used more and more in all different kinds of spaces. You know, academics argue about how to define it, how to measure it. We use the term resilience here to recognize that, you know, people trying to grow, process, access, distribute food in cities face a lot of challenges, and most of them are from the actions of others. These are not natural challenges, whether it's the increased pressures of heat and water shortages caused by climate change, the legacies of soil contamination in cities wrought by redlining and pollution, the hazards of wildfires in and around cities due to the outlawing of indigenous land stewardship practices, to how COVID worsened the impacts of food apartheid on food insecurity. So here we're interested in our speakers' perspectives and experiences on how we can steward ecosystems and organize communities in ways that reduce the impact of these crises and also help transform our cities in ways where these crises no longer exist. And so our speakers hope to share lessons from their research and experience that lead to practical actions. And even though we're talking about the agroecological city, we also hope to emphasize how interconnected cities and rural areas are, really trying to disintegrate what is really a false divide. And so the format today will be 2 to 3 speakers each along 4 different themes. We'll put the schedule in the chat right now so you can see what this lineup looks like. We'll have time for 1 to 2 questions in between speakers and themes, and then we'll have a couple of breaks for longer Q&As after the first 4 speakers, and then again at the end of the session. So please share your questions in the chat as they come to mind, and we'll help collect and organize them and let the speakers know. We do have an ambitious schedule today, and so I will try to keep us on target so that we do have plenty of time to address your questions and have some conversation. And so then the last thing before we get started is please, if you can, stick around and be sure to fill out the evaluation form at the end. That really helps us understand how we can keep improving. All right, and so with that, I want to kind of turn it over to our speakers today. We're going to start with our first theme around soil health and different dimensions and impacts of building healthy soils. And we're going to have Cole Rainey, I believe, begin. Cole is a PhD student here at UC Berkeley. So Cole, if you want to go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much, Tim. And thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to go really fast today as I only have 8 minutes, and I'm going to try and walk through a lot of content and ideas. My name is Cole Rainey. I am a graduate student here at UC Berkeley in the Department of Environmental Science. I use he, they pronouns. I'm also a farmer at the Gill Tract Community Farm and with Berkeley Student Farms. And I want to start with the story of farmers across California, an incredible variety and diversity of folks who are farming in different ways and are on our land and capital poor, right? They don't have a lot of access to land or capital, and they're mobilizing their communities in really unique ways. So I wanted to ask, the research question I've been asking as a part of our broader project is, what soil health praxis are capital and land poor farmers using to realize food sovereignty across urban and rural landscapes? And there are sort of 3 levels to this research, right? So one is the level of soil health and ecology, and that's kind of at the ground level. Then we have sort of the level of critical pedagogy and embodied knowledge and how we learn through doing. And then at the highest level is around food sovereignty and community action and how communities mobilize when they have limited access to land or capital to conserve soil and to create food sovereignty in their communities. And so to do this, we went with a community participatory action research model where we were going back to communities, having field days and symposiums where we would study, we would take action with the community, then we would collect that evidence and analyze it and reflect, and then we would go back and we would do another study, and we would sort of move in this way with the community, right, to understand. And one of the things that really came to the fore was this particular no-till practice, a way of treating the soil with a conservation ethos that didn't require a lot of machinery or inputs, but was really efficient ecologically, socially, culturally, and allowed for robust food production on small plots. And some of the principles of this method that we learned through working with these small farmers was they were minimizing disturbance, they were maximizing biodiversity, they had really high densities of plantings in space and time. They were promoting holistic management and maximizing biological activity, and they were trying to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And so as I and the speaker coming after me, Tanama, will talk about, we created a case study of this practice at the Oxford Tract in downtown Berkeley. And this is a map of our 4-year no-till experiment in downtown Berkeley. You can see it's a replicated field experiment where we were looking at a combination of no-till management compared with sort of a conventional tillage management. You can see the difference right here on the screen of what our no-till beds versus these tilled beds on the right look like. And then we also were looking at a cover cropping versus continuous production system. So we were overlaying those 2 treatments in this urban farm in downtown Berkeley. And we were looking at a number of different things. One was resilience to drought. So one of the findings of our study, and you can see here, this green row here is one of our no-till beds, and this kind of these yellower rows here are our tilled beds. One of the things we found was that when we grew under drought stress, we tried to grow a crop of black beans, and we found that the dry biomass, the yield per plant, and the total yield under drought stress, a simulated drought stress, were higher in our no-till and cover crop treatments. And we also found that soil moisture content in the soil at depths was much, much higher when we used this sort of no-till treatment. We also used a technique to explore the sort of soil pore architecture using water retention curves. And so this curve up here at the top was from the very first year of our study, but here in even just the second year of our study, just 2 years after implementing the method, we found that our no-till cover crop system found this shift towards smaller pores, but many more of them. And so that allowed for the soil to better hold moisture over the long, dry summer season. And another thing you'll notice is that our tillage and no cover crop treatment, this purple line here, was also shifting towards larger pores, which may have led to loss of water. We were also looking at fungal diversity. We found differences between the soil and the root systems in our experiment. So we found that while in the soil, actually the tilled systems had maybe higher fungal diversity, the opposite was true in the roots of the crops that we were growing. And we were looking at maybe a reversal of that trend, where in the roots of some of the crops in our no-till system, we actually found higher fungal diversity, or at least equal diversity across the treatments. We were also able to explore arbuscular mycorrhizal fungal communities. And there were some really interesting findings here, but I won't go too much into them because I want to get to other things. We explored bean nutrient content. So I told you we had a drought simulation and we grew black beans, and we looked at how well these plants took up nutrients, right? And did the management of our field impact how the beans acquired, key nutrients, how much protein was in the beans. And we didn't find any significant differences in nutrient acquisition by plants depending on how we treated them. But this was a proof of concept that we could grow really protein rich and calorically dense food in an urban center and really impact food security in our community. So it had these kind of other benefits. And then finally, we also were tracking carbon and the movement of carbon across our field. These systems have really high compost use. And so we were able to track how the compost leached across the field using a method called basically that probes active carbon or labile carbon. And so this is another kind of interesting aspect of our study. And I think really the main thing I want to drive home is that in just 2 years of implementing this no-till method, we saw rapid shifts in soil pore architecture, fungal diversity, crop growth and yield, and all of these other measures, microbial enzyme activity, some of the things I didn't even get to touch on in this very short talk. So this is really exciting. And I'm also interested in other questions though, beyond the ecological, like what futures are latent in soil, and what is the relationship between soil and the body? How does soil serve as a medium for collective action? And what constitutes embodied knowledge in agroecology? And how might it inform a praxis of healing, care, and liberation, right? And working here in Huichin, in stolen, unceded Ohlone territory, right, we have to think about how the shell mounds here in the Bay Area were destroyed, sacred sites desecrated to fertilize farms, right? How they were destroyed to pave the city streets that built the Bay Area. And so we're working at the Giltrek to rematriate land and working with the Sogorea Land Trust to return land to Ohlone stewardship. But this colonial institution that we call UC Berkeley, it further complicates these efforts by not recognizing Ohlone sovereignty, by not supporting Indigenous and Native students when they try and apply to use field space, even at the Oxford Tract or the student farms, right? So we're embedded within this complex legacy that actually and soil is this connective medium, right? It's this body that connects these struggles. And I know I'm probably almost at time, but I also want to talk about other struggles and how soil connects the student farms and Giltrek and these places where we're working through the medium of soil. So there was this Lead to Life, and Bronte Velez had a ceremony at Oscar Grant Plaza where they melted down guns into shovels and they laid out soil on the actual plaza of Oscar Grant. And that soil was then transported to the student farm. And then just a few years later, some of the students from our Berkeley student farms were able to go back to Oscar Grant and plant a food forest on the day of the election. And so there's this literal material exchange and this practice of solidarity and activism. And soil acts as this beautiful medium and sort of gestation, this place of imagining different futures for our communities, right? And so I could talk more about the Giltrek and all these other, about People's Park. Oh my gosh, it goes on and on and on, but I'll leave it there. Yeah, thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cole. We have a couple of questions that we could, from our participants as we transition to Tanama. So our first question is from Cindy. If you're using a cover crop, don't you turn it under? If so, how do you do it without tilling?
Oh, Cindy, great practical question. So there's a bunch of different ways that different farmers are experimenting with using cover crop in a no-till system. Some folks are terminating the cover crop, so cutting it right at the soil surface and then actually composting that in piles on site. Some folks use tarping or occultation, so basically using a mower or something to chop up the biomass into small pieces and covering it with a tarp or fabric, and then leaving it for a number of weeks to decompose. Some folks also use sort of like windrows, so they have basically like one row that's planted and one row that's composted, and they sort of go back and forth between those rows. And so they would pull the cover crop biomass onto the next row. There's all kinds of different ways that folks are recycling that biomass and building fertility on their farm.
Yeah, thank you, Cole. That's great. And just to note, we are going to kind of be keeping track of all the questions that we don't get to now, and we can return to as many as we can during our 10-minute Q&A break. So I want to turn it over now to Tanama Varas, who is with Agroecology Commons.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Cole. Yeah, so I'm Tanama. They, he, we pronouns are good. Calling from village of Huchin, which is in El Sobrante, just north of Berkeley right now. So I'm going to be sharing, building off of what Cole was sharing, since that was a project that we were working on for a number of years, and kind of my role within that project was stewarding the production side and crop planning, crop rotations, that kind of thing, and also trying to bring in the community as early as possible. So a lot of the crops that we were growing and bringing in were from a survey that was conducted at the UC Berkeley Food Pantry about what students wanted to see more of, what they were kind of missing, so that we could incorporate that, because a lot of the food was donated to the UC Berkeley Food Pantry and to other mutual aid organizations. You know, and there were some limitations, like people wanted bananas, but obviously in Berkeley we can't do that, right? But yeah, just sharing a little bit more on the highlights of a research project that is community based, and how we're incorporating the community actively within that, either through kind of farmer to farmer knowledge exchanges or events at a research site that is often closed off and not available to the public. And also through that food distribution, which other folks I think will get more into. But because I was also working with a mutual aid organization, we were able to combine and provide a lot of that produce to folks who needed it. And so for me, I'm really interested in how do collaborations with community organizations, social movements, and universities can kind of build off of each other to build that resilience within a place that is super dense. And, you know, Berkeley is a land-grant university, and most land-grant universities are in more rural areas. So it's kind of unique in that setting. And so being able to, just host students and host folks from around the country, internationally, to be able to show what we're doing, and not being prescriptive, right? Because part of what we're doing with agroecology is that we're sharing from our context, our geographic location, our soil. Oxford Tracts has been in production for almost 100 years. So just having that context behind that plot of land is also important. And being able to just show what can be done on a small plot of land, and how much food can be actually grown in kind of a biointensive no-till way. And so we were able to host a number of events, getting students involved, really putting the power in their hands. And at the same time, as Cole was kind of getting at the end of this struggle with also the university wanting to, develop those sites and build more housing. And so it's this complication of we need affordable housing, we also need food, and how to balance that and show the resilience and the power of not only the students, but the community members, right? So we have a lot of community members across the street from the Oxford Tract who are involved with coming to town hall meetings and also coming to pick food and being able to access that space and make it more available to people, because there's always those conflicts when you're working within institutions that don't always go smoothly with the community and what we're actually trying to build. And so being able to produce all that food, I don't think we got into the numbers, but in addition to the soil health, we were also looking at labor, right? Because a lot of these times this kind of agroecological production often is knowledge intensive and labor intensive. So wanting to support, because ultimately this is for small scale farmers, primarily in the East Bay, but can be applied throughout the country, the world, and seeing what is working and what isn't. And so being able to be in the field cutting daikons, the daikon cover crop, and planting directly into into the daikon in the ground, and seeing firsthand, observing it growing quicker, having more moisture content than kind of the field with broccoli that wasn't planted with the daikon cover crop, and then being able to show that to farmers in the East Bay, and have them try it on their own, and maybe it works for them and maybe it doesn't, but being able to leverage the university resources to not have the pressure of producing and yielding and having to put out input, right, to survive. And so I think those are some of the important collaborations that need to continue, of leveraging institutions in collaboration with social movements, and having them at the table at the beginning, to be able to continue these kinds of community-based participatory action research projects. And so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Tanama. I really, really appreciate how you kind of put this research project in the context of the community and how embedded it was in the community, and talking about sort of collaborations as a means to build resilience, but also the risks of when institutions aren't on board with that. So thank you so much. It's been a really pleasure to work with you and Cole on this project for the last few years. We have a couple of minutes for questions. If anybody has a question for Tanama specifically, please let us know. In the meantime, we had a couple of questions that we could return to as Josh and Sarah get set up. We have a question from the National Family Farm Coalition asking about guesses about the lack of significant differences in nutrient uptake. I think this is referring back to the beans in the drought experiment here.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak on that. And, Tanama, if you have any thoughts on it too, would love to hear your thoughts about, our black bean growing, our experience growing black beans in the city. And I'm thinking about when we fed all those people at Giltract, we made like huge pots full of black beans, and just thinking about nourishing and feeding our community. But I think the nutrient acquisition thing, from most of what I've read in the literature, it has to do generally with more to do with the variety that you're growing rather than the growing conditions. Although growing conditions do play, of course, an important factor. I think that I think that we're still kind of delving into why that may be the case. We're interested in how fungal symbioses might have influenced nutrient acquisition. We also didn't see a difference in protein content. But yeah, I think that maybe if we had continued this experiment for more time, we would have seen more of a difference. But again, I think the dominant kind of factor that determines nutrient acquisition just first and foremost is actually the variety of plant being grown, and then the growing conditions are sort of secondary. And maybe we just haven't been implementing this practice for long enough for those environmental factors to really play a part.
Great, thank you, Cole. Yeah, and if you if you have questions for Ton and Ma, we'll return to those in just a little bit during our first Q&A break. So now we're moving on to our second theme today, where we're going to be thinking about insect pests, and beneficial insects, and also soil contamination and remediation. So first, I want to welcome Josh Arnold, who was a PhD student at UC Berkeley and now professor at Warren Wilson College in North Carolina. So thank you so much, Josh. Welcome.
Hello all, just give me 1 second here while I get this set up. And we will go there. Hopefully you all can see that. Great, so my name is Joshua Arnold. I am currently the professor of sustainable agriculture at Warren Wilson College in Asheville, North Carolina, and we are on Cherokee land. Today I'm going to be talking about ecological pest management in urban agriculture. So I'm going to specifically be talking about parasitoid wasps. So these are an often overlooked essential component of ecological pest management on urban farms and farms in general. These wasps are incredibly small. So they are typically between 1 and 3 millimeters in length. So you can think about the width of a quarter, perhaps a quarter and a half. So pretty small, and they often escape our observation, but are responsible for a great amount of biological control in our urban farms. The importance of these wasps is kind of encapsulated in what they do. So in this instance, we're talking about an aphid parasitoid, and you can see some cabbage aphids here in the middle. These parasitoid wasps utilize aphids to complete their life cycle. So female parasitoid wasp will oviposit using its ovipositor. These are stingless wasps, so very small stingless wasps, into aphids, and that egg will hatch and turn into a larva and develop inside the aphid. And then they will hatch out, a wasp will hatch out of that aphid and continue this process over and over again. An important aspect of this is that parasitoid wasps do not eat their host, they use their host to complete their life cycle, but most often they sustain themselves as an adult on flower nectar. And that will be a very important component of this talk. For me, in my research, and for many others, we really asked the question, how do we increase the number of parasitoid wasps on urban farms? And potentially, is there a way to make them more effective at reducing herbivorous pests on our farms? As we know, many of our urban farmers do not use pesticides for ecological and human health reasons. So it's important to think about ways that we can increase the amount of prey removal and prey mortality by natural enemies in these landscapes. Another question that really is fundamental to this, especially in urban agriculture, is the landscape factors. So as we know, many of these urban farms exist in areas that have a lot of industry and built environments around them. And the question and the hypothesis is does that amount of impervious surface, so concrete and buildings and other aspects of the built environment, reduce the amount of parasitoid wasps on farms or reduce the diversity of parasitoid wasps on farms? This graphic here kind of illustrates the 11 urban farms that we worked with in the East Bay area, the San Francisco Bay. And from large to small farms, and from left to right on your screen, from farms that are in very highly dense areas to farms that are in more green areas, so more green space surrounding the farms versus farms that have more of the built environment surrounding them. The other thing that we have to ask ourselves is whether or not the landscape is mediating the diversity and abundance of wasps on the farms, of Parasitoid Hymenoptera on the farms, or do factors, local factors such as practices, have a determining factor of what kind of biodiversity and abundance we see of parasitoids on the farm. So one of the things I measured at these 11 farms that I've been working with for several years now is the percent of mulch cover, floral diversity, so the types of flowers that are on the farm, crop biodiversity, so how many crops are being grown in a given area, the density of host plants, and in this context, we looked at brassicas. We're looking mostly at cabbage aphids for this research. So we looked at collard greens, tree collards, broccoli, and kale, and how the land is utilized, right? So the production area of the land, how much of the land is out of production, and how much has been set aside for natural habitat or potentially pollinator gardens. Of much importance, as well as the size of the urban farm, right? So is it a large farm or a small farm? For the purpose of this presentation today, I'm going to be talking about only 2 wasps that we measured on farms, the ichneumon brachynids, Aphid, and these are primary parasitoids of oftentimes cabbage aphid. What we measured is that there was an increased diversity or increased abundance of these wasps. I'm sorry, so there was more of these cabbage aphid wasps on farms with increased floral diversity. So the more kinds of flowers that urban farmers were growing on the farms, the more of these wasps were there. The other wasp that I'm going to be talking about very briefly is a chalcid, Ephinelids, and these are also parasitoids of aphids. And the percent coverage of mulch and leaf litter determines the abundance of these wasps on the farm. So we have 1 aphid wasp that is increased abundance with increased floral diversity, and 1 aphid wasp that has increased abundance with mulch coverage. So the next thing we have to ask ourselves is, if there are more of them, are they actually being effective at reducing the amount of aphid pests on the farm? So over here on the right, you can see some cabbage aphids that have been parasitized, and a hatch has been cut out and the wasp has flown away. We measured parasitism rates, so we counted the amount of aphids that had been parasitized at each one of these farms for over 2 years throughout the entire growing season. And we found that percent coverage of mulch and also crop biodiversity increased parasitism rates about 10% for every unit of increase of the mulch, and crop biodiversity impacts were slightly lessened, but mulch was very, very important. I also looked at, did a literature review, and we looked at all of the publications that are talking about biological control, natural pest control on urban farms throughout the United States. This graph is a representation of not only parasitoid wasps, but a whole group of beneficial insects, such as ladybugs, lacewings, etc. And we also found that floral abundance and floral richness were important in predicting the efficacy and diversity and abundance of natural enemies. Once again, mulch and leaf litter, very important. Plant species richness or crop biodiversity, very important as well. So the takeaways for all of you folks that are out there listening in the land is increase the amount of mulch coverage you have on your farm. So we're not entirely certain what that connection is between parasitoids and abundance and diversity of parasitoids on the farm with mulch, but it does increase the diversity and abundance of parasitoids on the farm. More flowers, ensure that you have flowering, floral provisioning, so you have flowering plants throughout the entire season. From the beginning of the season all the way to the end, and grow a diversity of crops. And hopefully you should see a reduction of your aphid pests on your farms. I'd like to give a very hearty and very emotive thanks to all of my community partners that allowed me access to their farm, that were there, that helped me develop these research questions, that really allies throughout the entire time and welcomed and accepted me. So there's a couple other that I don't have logos for. So the Berkeley Urban Gardeners, Ashby, Peralta, Northside, and the Laney College Farm as well. It's been very, very important in my research. And that is all I've got. And I am willing to answer some questions if you all have them.
Great. Thanks so much, Josh. And thanks too for really getting us down to some really practical advice on how we can manage the ecology of these insects to try to help control things like aphids. We can have time for one quick question. There's been a few that have popped up, and then we'll return to more. So one quick question from Leslie. Does mulch provide habitat for the parasitoids?
So that's a really important and interesting question, Leslie. We're not entirely certain what the connection between the mulch coverage is and the diversity and abundance of parasitoids on the farms. My hypothesis is that with increased mulch, you're going to have increased diversity in the soils themselves. So you're essentially supercharging the basis of the food web, and that these wasps are just responding to an increased diversity and abundance of prey insects in the farms. But that's another question that we'll have to answer in the next iteration of research.
Thanks so much, Josh. And now I'd like to welcome Sarek Matson, who also former PhD student at Berkeley, now a postdoc at University of Minnesota. He'll be talking with us about soil contamination remediation. So thanks so much. Welcome, Sarek.
Sure, thanks, Tim. And thanks everybody so much for being here. It's really great to see all these folks on Zoom. And Minnesota is great, but I really miss the Bay Area. So especially great to see all the Bay Area representation. So let me share my screen. Okay, so what I work on is helping all of us who grow food in urban soils to deal with the fact that we know that there are usually harmful chemicals in urban soils. So we need to understand how we can grow food safely. And what happened in this project was that we really shifted our approach. We started out really thinking about the specifics of soil testing and how to get the best possible data, and then really how to help people interpret those results in order to understand how to work with their soil, considering what might be in it. And what was frustrating in trying to go forward with this project is that we really kept coming up against a wall, that the US EPA doesn't actually have guidelines for urban ag soils in terms of what level of contaminants are okay in urban soils if you're going to be growing food. So we actually went straight to the California EPA and talked to some toxicologists there. And we said, look, we really need to help people test their soil. We need to be able to give people some really clear guidelines about what to do if they get their soil test back and there's like 160 milligrams per kilogram lead in that soil. And there are all these different regulations and none of them are specific for urban ag soils. How are we supposed to make this clear for people? And they said, well, good luck. We can't actually give you any clear guidelines because guess what? It's specific to every site. So what happens on every site and every garden is different. And that means that the risk that folks gardening in any particular garden are experiencing is different. So really, instead of trying to take this sort of hard and fast threshold approach, we realized that we need to take a more harm reduction risk-based approach where we came up with some tools that anybody would be able to use actually regardless of whether folks can test their soil in order to understand how to keep themselves safe while growing food. We did this work through, we sort of tested our approach through some workshops, and this is one workshop here that we did out in El Sobrani with the folks now with Agroecology Commons. We also did another awesome workshop at Spiral Gardens in South Berkeley. And we wanted to do one at Ashby Gardens, and I see that Bonnie's on here today, but I think that was one of those days when it was over 100 in the East Bay, and we called it off because it was too hot. So as we developed our new framework, we thought a lot about safe growing practices and then a risk assessment approach, and how then soil testing could be this third tier of this overall approach that can help people grow food safely. In terms of safe growing practices, we're talking about things that we probably all know, but maybe we don't all do. And I'm definitely including myself in this category. So we wanted to encourage people, you know, if you're growing food in urban soils, we should wash our hands and wash our produce before eating. So I know that the greens and the tomatoes are really great, you know, if you eat them right out of the garden, but if we're trying to decrease risk, we should really wash all that food first. We know that it's really important for kids to get their hands dirty in soil and to make that connection. But if we think that there might be harmful chemicals in soil, we should try to avoid having kids touch that soil, or definitely help them wash their hands afterwards. Try to not track soil inside, so leave our gardening shoes outside. Not work with dry soil so we can decrease dust. Not work with bare soil. Plant hedgerows to catch vehicle exhaust. Plant leafy greens and vegetables where chemical levels are likely to be lower. And then also just don't grow in the ground if we think chemical levels might be high, and instead use raised beds. And then paired with that, we worked with toxicologists to develop 12 questions that folks can ask themselves to really do a self-guided risk assessment. So this is really putting the power in the hands of all of us, because we're the ones who actually have these answers. Nobody else has these answers for us. Like, do we have kids? How often are those kids in the garden? Is the garden huge? Is the garden actually really small? Is the garden near old buildings, or do we live near newer buildings? Is most of the produce that we're eating coming from our garden, or is that supplemental produce, and are we getting our produce from other sources? What's our soil pH? And those are just a few of these 12 questions that can really help us all do a risk assessment to find out whether we're in a lower risk situation or a higher risk situation. And then if we are able to test our soil, but even if we're not, we can think about where chemical levels are likely to be higher and lower in urban yards. So thinking about a yard here with the building, we're likely to find higher chemical levels, especially lead, but also other chemicals in the soil within 10 to 15 feet of that building wall. So that's definitely true for older buildings painted in lead paint, but it's also true for, say, brick buildings, that because any building wall is going to catch dust that's in our urban air, and then that dust is going to wash down into the soil right beside the building. So basically, if we're trying to look for an area in our yard that's probably going to have lower chemical levels, we should really try to go as far away from any buildings as possible. And then, so this is where we got really excited about soil testing. We did get to go into the weeds here, so to speak. And what we wanted to do was adapt soil sampling methods that professionals use, like EPA folks and remediation companies. And we wanted to take this method and make it work for anybody, really, and try to break down this method into some really clear steps that folks can use to get really good quality data. So what usually happens when folks test soil is people are advised to just take maybe 3 samples and mix them together and send them in. But the thing is, if you take 3 different samples, you might get totally different results just because of the way chemicals are distributed in soil. So we actually encourage people to do a lot more work. Each one of these little symbols represents a hole that we wanted people to dig to get a really good representative sample in order to really understand what's in their soil and be able to move forward. the last thing we did was then develop this cool little flow chart, which I won't go through in detail, but we wanted to help people actually understand their results once they get them back from the lab and be able to think about their numbers and decide if, again, if they're in a lower risk or higher risk situation, feeding back into those risk assessment questions. In our workshops that we did, we actually found that soil testing didn't end up working for most folks. About 75% of folks who attended the first workshop in our 2 workshop series didn't actually end up collecting soil samples. And that's totally okay, because there are so many other ways to decrease your risk to contaminants when you're growing food. But from the 25% or so that did sample their soil and get their results, they felt that it was worth it. It was worth doing that, collecting, digging all those holes, putting in some extra effort. So we felt that this method actually would work for people who were able to test their soil. We're trying to share this more broadly. We've developed a UC Extension fact sheet that should be coming out soon to just share this information as broadly as possible. Also, we're putting together more training modules so that folks can teach these workshops in their own communities. So with that, thank you so much again for being here. I think we might have a few minutes for questions.
Thanks so much, Sarek. I mean, certainly as somebody with a little 4-year-old, I think having this more thoughtful, comprehensive set of guidelines is super helpful, rather than just relying on kind of one threshold level to guide our decisions around what's safe. So thank you so much. This is really cool work. Yeah, let's have kind of one question for Sarek, and then we'll start kind of our more open-ended Q&A session. So one that came up, there's a bunch of questions here. One is, can you expand on the linkage between soil pH and soil contaminants? I know that's a big question, but maybe provide some principles that folks can think about.
Yeah, absolutely. So especially if we're thinking about metals like lead, those metals happen to be more soluble. So that means they can leave the soil and go into the water or go into our stomachs if we happen to eat that soil when the pH is lower. So that starts happening. I mean, really, we're talking about once we get below pH 6.5, pH 5, even down to pH 4. I mean, those are super acidic conditions. And so that's where we're going to see those metals be more soluble. But this is convenient generally because most nutrients in soil are actually most available for plants right around pH 7. So really, that's the best pH to be at, whether we're talking about being safe from contaminants or having healthy plants.
Great, thank you. So we have a few more minutes for Q&A. So this is also a good time to put your hands in and shake them all about. Do anything you can to kind of rustle your body a little bit. Yeah, there we go. We got some shaking going on. And so I want to return now to some of the questions from earlier. I think we have one question that was directed towards Tanama. So since agroecology is labor and knowledge intensive, could you speak to how knowledge passed down through generations, to how knowledge is passed down through generations, especially in the current moment as the number of farmers nationwide continues to decrease?
Yeah, this is important question, and something I think we've been talking, at least in a lot of circles I've been talking about. I think, yeah, it's hard because if people aren't connected to the land or grew up in a farming setting, it's been disconnected or lost. So there's a lot of reconnecting and remembering of this knowledge, either ancestrally or connecting with other folks who have that knowledge. So there's a lot of like farmer training programs that are going on, and Agroecology Commons has a Bay Area farmer to farmer training program that will be happening this summer as well. And a lot of that is kind of trying to be as comprehensive as possible with agroecology knowledge, not just technical knowledge, but also political education, because it's important to have that kind of fully rounded perspective. And I also know Yeah, Liz Carlisle, Maya Montenegro put out some articles about this. I think Liz might be here, so maybe she can share some of those articles on kind of this new ecologically skilled workforce. So I think that would be helpful. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Tanama. Liz is indeed here. Maybe Liz could put a couple of links in the chat to some of those articles that Tanama was referencing. And I also just want to note, Josh kindly answered some questions in the chat. If you want to scroll up, you can see some of the questions around mulching practices and that kind of thing, see what Josh answered there. We'll return to another question for Sarek. Did your work inspire remediation of toxic urban soils? Has anyone remediated using fungi?
Ooh, that is such a good question. There are so many ways to, on the one hand, there are a lot of really good ideas about how we might remediate soils. In general, the overall approach seems to be it's best to increase the organic matter in soils really by any means necessary. So a lot of times that means adding more compost. I think definitely increasing the fungal activity can be great. And I also saw that somebody asked a question about the Fishbone remediation project that was down in West Oakland, on the other side of West Oakland BART. And that, I think, didn't end up being quite as successful as people wanted it to be. And actually, I think they found that, well, they were trying to add a lot of phosphorus to stabilize lead, but they actually found that they added too much phosphorus. And actually, the phosphorus ended up being a little too much for the plants to handle. So I think that just speaks to the fact that sometimes it's kind of tricky to balance what you're putting in order to get the intended effect.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sarek. I saw another comment asking for more clarification on the connection between soil pH and soil contamination. So maybe in the second half of our session, Sarek, I don't know if there's like an extension publication or a fact sheet that you could maybe put a link into the chat for folks who are more interested in that. Thank you. Let's see. So we have time for a few more questions. And so I want to return to one for Cole here and about the complications or limitations from the side-by-side test plots that seem to be pretty close together. And certainly I can attest to that, knowing this experiment well at the Oxford Tract. So I would imagine these production practices impact fields beyond just the row, say in terms of water infiltration or microbial life. So how might things be different or not based on just the scale of the experiment that's being done? Great question.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think you asked that, Evan, over at CAF. I think I also want to just broaden the question a little bit for anyone who's interested in no-till, anyone who's interested in either transitioning away from like maybe a traditional tillage system or is interested in starting a no-till garden or farm yourself. I definitely there is definitely like complications with transitioning from a conventional tilled system to a no-till system, and there definitely were some real challenges. So like you can see in this photo just side by side what it looks like, and I think one of the hardest things actually has just been cycling and like actually lining up the cropping cycles in ways that are efficient for the amount of labor that we had. So it actually, a lot of the problems came down to like a labor issue where we were having to by hand clear maybe this whole bed to turn over all these kales in our no-till bed, but then that timing was completely off with maybe like immature plants in the tilled beds, and so then we're risking all these immature plants that are just a foot away by having to do this really intense like hand labor scale work in the no-till. And then I think the other thing, like you mentioned about water infiltration and microbial activity, I think that's one of the things I'm most surprised by, is that these are only a few feet away and that these soil ecosystems really were dramatically different over just 2 years, I was honestly shocked. I didn't think we were going to see any differences. So I think it really is a testament to just in this left part of the picture here with these kales, like, by not disturbing even those 2 or 3 feet of soil, we saw these dramatic differences. So, but there were these problems with like compaction from the tires of the tractor that caused difficulties then like in multiple seasons of trying to do tillage. So there were some real challenges, like practical challenges. But I think those are also just emblematic of the challenges, the broader challenges of trying to transition to no-till more generally.
Great, thanks, Cole. I can't help myself but add, just one little thing, which is, I think we can learn a lot about certain aspects of the soil from this scale of experiment. Let's say it gets a lot more complicated when we think about like the above ground, what's happening above the soil in terms of insects moving around and that kind of thing. This scale of experiment it's harder to learn because things are moving around a lot more. And so with that, thanks for all these awesome questions. We're going to kind of transition into the second half of our session here, where we move a little bit beyond just our food production practices and think about how we deal with wildfires and wildfire risk in and around cities, on farms, and also around food access and distribution. So we'll start with our wildfire, and we're going to have a joint presentation now from Natalia Pinzon from UC Davis and Evan Wigg from the Community Alliance of Family Farmers. So I'll turn it over to you two.
Great. Thanks so much for organizing this and having us. I'm going to go ahead and jump into a screen share, and Natalia, you can get us started.
Hi, everyone. Our talk is on this question of, do wildfires discriminate? As we went through the fires season, we've had people say, oh, well, wildfires don't discriminate. So it really brought this question to light, and that's what we want to share with you today. My name is Natalia Pinzon Jimenez. I'm with Farmer Campus and UC Davis. I'm a doctoral candidate studying how farmers are responding and adapting to wildfires.
I'm Evan Wigg. I'm with Community Alliance of Family Farmers. We've been serving and representing family farmers across California for over 4 decades.
You can go to the next slide, Evan. So we won't have time to really talk about what you can do on your farm when there's a wildfire. We won't have time to talk about emergency preparedness, response, recovery, indigenous perspectives of wildfire management, fire ecology. These are all really important issues, and we cover them in our disasters clearinghouse that CAF and Evan have put together, as well as an online course called Farming Through Wildfire Season, and you can find that on Farmer Campus. So for an overview, we're going to briefly, next slide, we're going to briefly talk about wildfire stories, what we've seen on the ground during the fires, how wildfires and COVID intersect, and some proposed solutions. Next slide. So to begin with wildfire stories, we, through our work, we want to share with you what we've seen, who were the most impacted, what problems did wildfires cause, and what were some of the systemic problems that they illuminated. And Evan will start us off.
All right. Well, so to begin with, I would really want to talk about the theme of this whole conference is, the resilient city. And I think it's important to point out that, a resilient city isn't just about the total autonomy of a city's ability to grow its own food, but rather about the quality of the relationships, including the relationships with our rural comrades, those who are growing the majority of our food, right? And what those relationships can be is it could be grassroots mutual aid networks, or those relationships can also manifest themselves in the form of policies from the federal level. And so we're going to be touching on a number of those as we saw them play out over the course of far too many wildfires over the past few years. I'm based here in Sonoma County, and every fall it has become fire season. It's not just an event, it's a season. And it seems to be that way increasingly for the rest of California, and I imagine other places around the world as well. So I really want to talk about, that over the course of those past few years, we worked with farmers across California. And I'm going to talk about these rural farmers, but I'm going to talk about them as they relate to our urban communities, because the issues, both the problems that perpetuate these fires, as well as the solutions that we see, really come not from how do individuals respond or prepare, but about how do communities, regional communities and partnerships respond, and either resulting in failures or resulting in some success stories. So what we saw was, a lot of rural communities were hard hit by that. One of the big challenges is just mass confusion. When a fire hits, evacuation orders come in, and suddenly you have to leave your farm, but you can't get back on without the permission of a sheriff. And you can't even get into to irrigate your crops, even if your farm isn't hit. If you're in evacuation zone, 1 or 2 days without irrigation, that's the loss of your entire crops. Meanwhile, you're trying to evacuate livestock. You're dealing with different information from different agencies. It's total confusion, mass confusion. Meanwhile, you're dealing with power outages, and if you have a cold storage on your farm, that could be, again, your entire crop, your entire livelihood is gone. And over the course of these closures, the power outages, evacuations, if you're a small family farm relying on farmers markets for your sales, most farmers operate on incredibly thin margins. And so 1 or 2 missed farmers markets could mean the difference between going in the red. And that's an economic situation a lot of farmers can't always recover from. So it's a really challenge. And on top of that, and this is something that's important for the urban folks to realize, is that in the rural communities, when it comes to fighting fires, they're oftentimes the last priority. When it comes to firefighting services, the priority of firefighters is usually about how can we best focus on the most populated areas to save the most people, the most buildings. So if you're a farm out in the middle of the boondocks, you're going to be the last person to get your power back. You're going to be the last person to get responded to. So, and on top of that, the last challenge, of course, is that smaller farms face additional challenges. It could be that they're immigrant-owned farms who have language barriers, and so trying to get that information. It could be that they simply don't have access to the resources to prepare or invest in generators. All these different things that just make it harder, again, working on really small profit margins. So what I want to talk about here is how farmers responded. They really do have to respond on their own, but I also want to talk about what are some of the systems we have in place from the top level, sort of the top-down model, the linear model. You have things like crop insurance, but most crop insurance doesn't cover small farms. Crop insurance is designed to fill out paperwork for a single commodity crop on thousands of acres. It's not designed to deal with a 2-acre farm that's growing 60 different fruits and vegetables. The paperwork isn't designed for that. And that's what we see over and over again in terms of emergency services, not just in things like crop insurance, but also in emergency food programs. You have things like FEMA and emergency food programs that basically come into a community that's been devastated by a fire or is currently being devastated by a fire, and they bring in emergency food to feed those in need. But what you have is a food bank in a community that is distributing food to people who need it, which is great. But they're bringing that food in from the large commodity markets outside of that community. Meanwhile, there might be a farm down the road from that food bank that just lost its markets, and they're suffering, and they're not able to sell in through that top-down federal FEMA program, which is kind of backwards, right? You have a community that's suffering, but the farms that could feed those folks can't get the food there because they're not getting the money from the federal government to feed those families. And then comes to financial aid and resources. Now, the challenge when it comes to that is that these systems are designed for the low-hanging fruit, which means those who are most able and in the best capacity to get that funding, to fill out that paperwork, to know their FSA officer, to have staff on their farm, to be able to pick up the phone and call the right people to get the paperwork, to get the aid in, those are going to be the ones who get the resources. Whereas small farms who don't have the time, wherewithal, or education to access those resources oftentimes get overlooked. And unfortunately, and unfortunately, this is what we see in government services across the board. Whenever there's a disaster, and we're going to be talking about the relationship between fires and COVID, but we see this over. I mean, the entire agricultural industry in America is based on subsidies, right? We all know that, but farming is a risky business. The challenge is that what we see when it comes to government aid is, I want to show you this graph here. This is just one example where we had literally billions of dollars to support farmers who were impacted by Trump's trade war, right? That is how how we operate, whether it's a fire or it's COVID or it's a trade war. We provide funding to farmers who are in need, but time and time again, the vast majority of those funds go towards large farms, and in most cases, that means large male white farm owners, and that's a huge challenge. So I just want to talk a little bit about some alternatives, right? We have to think about things holistically, every step of the way. Getting food to families that must go together with farmer aid, not separately. So is another model possible? This is just an example of some things that organizations did and at the grassroots, which was we started to go to farmers markets, gather donations from farmers, foods, and then distribute that to organizations that were distributing to families in need, evacuees, people who lost their homes, people who lost their jobs or were struggling to make ends meet. We were able to get those donations, but what we realized very early on was that as we're doing this, we're taking donations from small farms and then giving them to families in need without providing the compensation to keep those farms going into the future. So this is where that partnership comes in. We started going into towns and cities and asking people not just to help distribute the food, but actually pay the farmers for their food, especially those farmers that were impacted, who were no longer selling to the restaurants that were closed, were no longer selling to the farmers markets that no one wanted to go to because you couldn't breathe in the air. And so what we created was this sort of alternative grassroots, FEMA emergency food system that ended up getting thousands of dollars worth of fruits and vegetables and meats directly to families. But it had to happen on the grassroots because that closed loop system within our community wasn't paid for or provided by the federal government. These mutual aid networks popped up at the grassroots. And so, it's really important for folks to think about anonymous farmers can't rely on the support of their customers. So that urban-rural support network only exists with strong relationships. That means through farmers markets where people know the farmer they're buying from, have built that relationship, people who join CSAs and are continually in communication with their farmer and their customer. But in these sort of anonymous food systems, that just simply doesn't exist. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that thinking has changed over the course of the past few years. We've done this through several fires. We've done this now through lessons we learned through COVID, but we'll get to that in a moment. Probably run out of time here. So I'm going to pass it back to Natalia to talk about the other side of the coin, which is the farm workers.
I'm just briefly going to talk about farm workers. Evan, go ahead to the next slide. We're finding severe neglect and inequity in our work with serving farm workers during disasters. We've had farmers sending us videos of them working in the field with walls of fire behind them. We've seen farmers working days without proper personal protective equipment during the most severe air quality. And we've even had calls of farmers trying to flee but not knowing where to go, because when they get dropped off to work, they're not told where they are and they don't know where they are, and they might not even speak Spanish, let alone English. So we've clearly seen that farm workers are the most vulnerable population during wildfires, and it's especially those farm workers and migrant workers that are hired by these large farms that Evan was mentioning, these agribusinesses that hire them, that we've seen have failed to provide them with proper personal protection. And then they wake them up in the middle of the night to work, perhaps because there's less smoke, and also because it's less visible to the public and the scrutiny of the public. And these are people for whom missed work, just one day or a few days of missed work, means not being able to feed their families, and they certainly don't qualify for any financial support. Meanwhile, the media during fires isn't even showing their experiences. It's only now starting to see it. You can go to the next slide. So again, this is where mutual aid networks become really important. And through our partnerships with Nuestra Comunidad and many others, have been mobilizing to distribute supplies and using our urban-rural partnerships in order to raise funds, to move resources such as blanket, masks, food, money, and give them to the farmers when they need it, because the people who hire them aren't able to. We've tragically seen that crops are treated sometimes more valuably than the humans who are growing and harvesting them. So it really takes that community and stepping up during these disasters in order to protect them. Let's go to the next slide. So how did wildfires prepare us for COVID? Next slide. In our interviews with farmers, we find that many have identified their social networks and their social capital as one of the top most important attributes of their wildfire resilience. Farmers heavily lean on their social networks when responding and recovering from these disasters. In fact, it's these social networks and partnerships that arose during wildfires that facilitated rapid COVID response. For example, with Nuestra Comunidad, we now conduct tailgate trainings for farm workers to increase COVID response and awareness. And CAF has been able to quickly galvanize COVID response and relief because of the systems they put in place during wildfires. Evan, you can share more about that next.
Yeah, so I think, the question is, what did we learn from the wildfires, and with each successive wildfire that set us up to do things differently during COVID? And I'd say, one of the things I really want to emphasize that point of the low-hanging fruit. We oftentimes think of that as a positive comment, right? The low-hanging fruit is something that we want to pursue, but when it comes to support and aid of disaster victims, for instance, low-hanging fruit isn't necessarily a good thing. If you're trying to distribute funds and find people who need it, you can more easily find people who are visible, who have good websites, who have a clear presence, who are the squeakiest wheel gets the oil, right? But instead of thinking like that, we really have to think, who are the people who are falling through the cracks? Who are the people who are harder to get to, even to get the aid to? You would assume that it would be easy to distribute funds, but over the course of, our organization has raised over the past 4 years somewhere between $600,000 and $700,000 to distribute to disaster victims. And giving out that money is not an easy task, because we really have this responsibility to say, well, who really needs it? How are we finding them? Is it just the people who are directly in our network? Or do we really need to go out into these communities, find the farmers who are harder to find, who actually need this assistance more than others? So we started creating more earmarks for socially disadvantaged farmers, farmers of color, immigrant farmers, and farmers who didn't have access to traditional support networks. Those things, we had disaster victims who couldn't apply for federal funds because they didn't have citizenship. Or simply they didn't have the means to fill out the paperwork to get crop insurance or just basic insurance. So we totally redeveloped our allocation process of these funds. Another thing we started to see was, as COVID started to hit, you had things like the Farms to Families program, which was a program put on by Sonny Perdue's USDA, which basically gave $16 billion of funds directly to farms to provide boxes and then provide to families in need. Of course, in my personal opinion, the whole thing was a disaster because it was horribly mismanaged. There were, despite our advocacy early on in that program, what ended up happening was on the producer side, they started to implement all these what are called GAP certifications, which, long story short, it's basically certifications that are really only needed and used by larger farms selling into wholesale markets, which means that the farmers that lost their accounts at restaurants and local businesses during COVID, during the shutdowns, those folks didn't have those certifications. They didn't need those certifications. And so they suddenly got left out of the program entirely. So the vast majority of small scale family farms couldn't even sell into the program that was supported by the USDA using taxpayer money. Meanwhile, on the consumer side, there were a whole bunch of different things. Here locally, we had a was $11 million contract given to an airport kiosk company that had never distributed a single vegetable before receiving that contract. There were other instances where religious groups were given contracts to distribute the food and required prayer upon receiving the food. So, there was a number of problems along the way. And I think because of the fires and because of this experience we had, we were able to advocate early on and pinpoint those problems from the very get-go. And what I can say now is, what are the next steps? It's not perfect by any means, but we are starting to see people at higher levels recognize some of the disparities when it comes to disaster financial aid allocation. One thing that's happening right now is Biden's 2021 American Rescue Plan, right? This new stimulus package. Actually, if it passes, we'll see what it all shapes out to. Everything's kind of in flux at this point, but it could have a really large earmark specifically for farmers of color, farmers from disadvantaged backgrounds, where they're really saying, we're not just going to be distributing funds to whoever can fill out the paperwork fastest, but we're actually going to distribute the funds to those who need it and also try to rectify some of the inequities over the course of not just the past few years, but the past few generations of land theft, of continual government support going to a very small segment of our population. So that kind of advocacy that's taking place both through mutual aid networks and at the grassroots, but also the advocacy that's trickling up to our state and national capitals is actually starting to have an impact. We need a lot more, but recognizing the challenges faced in our rural communities really comes down to the advocacy that can be done in the urban environment. So I would really encourage everybody here who's an urban farmer or just an advocate of urban farming to also recognize that you have a big voice. The vast majority of policymakers and political influence comes from the cities, not the country, not the rural communities. So what you do, what you convince your elected representatives to do, is going to have a huge impact on how we allocate resources and funds to our rural farmers. Natalia?
Can you go to the last slide, Evan? I know we're over time, so I want to wrap up. Okay, last slide. So to this question of do fires discriminate, our absolute answer is yes. Wildfires perpetuate inequities and they visibilize disparity between people. But I want to leave you with this thought. This concept of resilience is heavily criticized for its support of the status quo. If we're being resilient to a deeply unjust and extractive system, then why would that be celebrated? So it's really important to ask ourselves resilience for whom and resilience for what? And what might be resilient to one, such as a vineyard, might not be resilient to another, such as a migrant worker. So instead, I want to leave you with this concept of transformative resilience, where the systems and the structures themselves are transformed in order to reduce risk and increase equity. And in Wildfires work, we want to think of resilience as something that begins with accepting that we live in a wildfire ecology and then redesigning our systems in order to coexist in harmony with this wildfire ecology. I'll leave you with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Natalia and Evan. Really amazing presentation and a lot to leave us thinking about in terms of how strong the connections are between cities and our rural communities, and how much more nimble kind of grassroots mutual aid efforts can be in responding to things like wildfires and COVID, but also, as you pointed out, then have this trickle up effect in terms of changing these state and federal policies in ways that actually make them responsive to the communities who need them most. And also thank you for leaving us with this idea of transformative resilience, not just bouncing back to where we are, but where we need to go. So we are, again, thank you. We are a couple minutes over, so we're gonna save questions for Natalia and Evan for our last Q&A session and move into our final theme around improving food distribution and access. And here we're going to have three speakers. I'm just going to go ahead and introduce them all because they're going to each talk for just a couple of minutes and then kind of have a conversation among themselves. So we have Lainey Siegner from, also formerly from UC Berkeley, now at the Terra Do Climate School. Natalia Samararo from the UC Berkeley Basic Needs Center, and Evan Hazlett from the Berkeley Food Network. So welcome to the three of you. We're looking forward to your presentations.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tim. And so I'm just going to kick things off by sharing my screen and showing a few visuals and maps to just ground us all in this work and my contribution to it. And I just want to say, hi, everyone, I'm Lainey. It is an honor to be here as part of this panel and this conference. And I just want to thank all the previous speakers and panelists, many of whom I've worked closely with, and that has been a true joy. So I'm going to start with sharing a little bit of my story and my journey into urban agroecology. And and the story starts and ends with education for me. It started when I was teaching 8th grade in Boston and searching for ways to engage and motivate my students. And we started a school gardening project, and just seeing the look on my students' faces when they got a seed to sprout, and we took over part of the concrete jungle around the school and made it into a garden that was growing food and tomatoes. It was just a real aha moment for me, which motivated me to come back to grad school and study more about urban sustainable food systems and climate change, which led me into this work with the Growing Roots project at UC Berkeley, where I was a grad student researcher from 2018 to 2020. So my research as part of this team focused on the food access and distribution networks within urban farms in the East Bay. And so before I jump into some of what I found and look at some maps and images of these farms together, I just want to put out a poll question in honor of Women's History Month and International Women's Day that came up earlier this week. And just, I want to see in the chat a few answers, see if anyone can hit the nail on the head here. Of the 35 urban farms in the East Bay that we surveyed and interviewed as part of this research, what percentage do you think of these urban farm survey respondents were women? I'll just pause and look at the chat for a second. You got one guess: 47, 77%, 70%, 15%, 70%. Okay, thank you all for these guesses. We're circling in. Some folks are getting close. Okay, I'll just pause and I will reveal the answer. It was 66% of our survey respondents. So no one guessed exactly that, but we had several guesses above 50%. And so I just want to highlight that a lot of this work that we studied and mapped and looked at is being done and led by women in the East Bay. And it is notoriously difficult to look at and understand the food access and distribution networks, because so many of them are not necessarily through monetary exchange or through commercial sales. They're through community gardens, volunteering in exchange for food, informal food distribution networks, exchanging materials for composting in exchange for some produce. It's just all kinds of things going on. So it was a fun challenge to talk and survey and participate in some volunteer work days to sort of trace this produce from the farm into people's homes, into food banks, into churches and community settings within the East Bay. So this is a map that built off some data that UC ANR and UC Cooperative Extension had already collected about where are the urban farms in the East Bay. So each little leaf represents an urban farm, and the colors correspond with Cal and Viroscreen data for each census tract. So we were just trying to put this together early on in the research to understand, are urban farms located in communities and neighborhoods experiencing a lot of compounding environmental injustices or disadvantaged communities? And the answer was largely yes. You can see a lot of farms kind of down here in South and West Oakland, and kind of sprinkling up through all the way up to Richmond and San Pablo in some of the red census tracts. And so of these farms, we surveyed and interviewed about 35 of them, and we're able to get some more granular data on sites like the Oxford Tract and the UC Gill Tract Community Farm, and tried to look at where is the produce going from all these sites, like who's keeping track of it, you know, what amounts are we sending where. So this shows a distribution map from the Oxford Tract, which Cole helped me put together. Thank you so much. And there's just a multitude. So the highlight from this and from, and from the Gill Tract map, which hopefully will reload. If it doesn't, I'm sorry, I'll go to the next slide anyways. But yeah, so the highlights of these maps is that the produce is just going to a variety of sites all over the East Bay, and it's happening in response to need, in response to partnerships, in response to human relationships. And I think this is just like, there was always this aspect of interviews, like, and we don't know where some of it's also going. Like, we welcome various people and groups to come and harvest and participate in the work. And especially with some of these farms that are more educational and geared towards the transformative act of teaching people how to grow food and where our food comes from. There's just a kind of bigger belief in the process of doing that, and sometimes less attention to weighing and writing down all the harvest totals and documenting carefully where they're going. That was a fun task to have a lot of research assistance on in the case of the Gill Tract, which I'm sorry, my map is not displaying for that. And then this graph just highlights that of the food that we were able to measure and document, you know, where it's going, how it's being distributed. Food sales was secondary to food donations. And then there was this, you know, various assortment of percentages of food that is either unharvested or composted on site, or in the words of the survey respondents, wasted, which represents that there is still a food recovery opportunity to be thinking about. And I think this is something that got a lot stronger actually in some cases during the COVID-19 pandemic, which I'll touch on in one of my photos in a second. And I wanted to highlight this quote from one of our interviews with the Mills College farm manager, that urban farming requires the political will in the community to see that growing food locally is something worth supporting financially and seeing it as a public health as well as an environmental issue. Many consumers of food don't know the challenges involved in growing food, so don't see it as an important service to support. I'd like to see this change and hope that our little college farm can help support in this effort. And so I just want to highlight, along with that quote, that the themes from the interviews kept bringing up over and over again that some of the biggest contributions of urban agriculture to community food security is through education, by being a vehicle to teach people how to grow food. I think especially in some of the school gardens that I studied in the East Bay, that reminded me of my time setting up a school garden in Boston, just seeing that sense of relief and that light bulb go off, especially for young kids, when they're able to safely dig in the soil and grow food that they're able to consume. It's part of like the transformational resilience, I think, and the shifts that we need to see in urban food systems. And it's really growing community connections. And urban agroecology will scale up through cooperative efforts, not through individual efforts. A lot of folks said things like, as I'm sure many in the audience would nod their heads with, that just being open and just being here is a huge accomplishment worthy of celebration, because there are so many forces looking to flatten urban farms at the first opportunity for development, or remove urban farmers from land that they've been accessing and put something else in place, and pitting against each other of the housing crisis and the food crisis, whereas really these two things could be working together. So when we build housing, we realize, what are these people going to eat? How can we provide accesses to doing so and participating in the food system locally? So those were just some of the themes. Some of these images, which I'll just skip through, fairly briefly, that show the diversity of flowers, the diversity of vegetables, the diversity of people. Oh no, it's gonna skip my slide of, shoot. Okay, so I don't know what happened with these images. I'm so sorry. Maybe if I exit presenter mode, it will show them. Okay, so hopefully you can see Wanda's truck full of starts in both of these two pictures, which I just want to highlight as an example of food system shifts that have happened due to COVID that I really hope to see persisting as we work to improve access and distribution to locally grown urban produce. These starts were grown by farmers up in Sonoma County and dropped off at a common collection site at the Permaculture Skills Center. And I helped Wanda load up her truck and my car and drive all these starts down to the East Bay. And I'm hoping that this kind of farm network effect of, okay, we have excess starts that we usually just grow to have extras, and then we compost them if we don't need them. But now, in light of COVID and everyone trying to increase the resilience and security of your local food system, which is just good anyways, not just in COVID times, are sharing and distributing these excess starts in a more higher value way. So this is definitely an example that I see as just a lighthouse of when the relationships are in place and when community connections and collaboration is able to occur, even under some of the most difficult circumstances. That is when they are most needed. And I just want to highlight that as a promising practice for accessing and distributing food within our communities. Wanda either found homes at the Hoover Garden or in home and community gardens all over the East Bay for all of these starts.
Lanny, I'm sorry to interject. I think I
and
just
I'll
want to
just-
make sure there's
go ahead.
enough time. We're probably at time. Might want to hand it over to Natalia and Evan.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Yes, thank you so much, Tim. Sorry, I always get carried away, but over to you, Natalia.
Thanks, Lainey. Yeah, I loved that quote that you shared a lot. And yes, and some of the discussion about how, as I'm sharing my screen, I'm just reflecting on what you just talked about. Thank you for sharing about, how often things are pitted against each other. Really false dichotomy kind of situation. There we go. Hi, everybody. I'm Natalia. I'm the Food Resource Coordinator for UC Berkeley's Basic Needs Center. Pretty young center here. I actually used to be a student and I graduated in 2018. We did not have a Basic Needs Center back then. So it's just a couple years old. And before that was our food pantry, which I think a lot of people recognize the food pantry as sort of the most visible resource of the Basic Needs Center. And it was all started by students. Student efforts really began everything that has to do with basic needs now on campus. And I think it's a huge topic these days, but I really want to recognize that, students advocated, fought, and made it happen. And there's still a lot to do. First, I want to start off really quickly. Just what do you feel? Send a response in the chat. It could be a word or a phrase. What comes up for you right now when you hear the term basic needs? I'm just kind of curious what people think of and what you jump to. Let's see if I can pull up the chat. Oh yeah, housing, support, sustenance, food, totally. Yeah, security. I think a lot of times are like what used to be was just like, oh, food, water, shelter. But you all are naming some of the really important things that I think we're realizing, or hopefully everyone's realizing are important parts. Nutrition, like belonging, community wellness, like mental health. These are all things that are now actually even officially being seen by UCOP as part of basic needs in the definition, but it was sort of a long time coming. So thank you for those responses. Gonna go to my next slide. There we go. So this is just some more recent photos of what is happening in terms of food distribution at our emergency food resource on campus. These are some of our student staff and some of our volunteers. We have about 100 volunteers this semester, and then we have about 10 paid student staff just in our pantry. Our Basic Needs Center employs over 25, I think, student staff. And yeah, I think I wanted to show kind of what's happening, but I also wanted to talk about, right now we've increased the space that we're utilizing, taking up in the student union on campus, because during the COVID pandemic, there's been more recognition of this need, but a lot of the issues, the gaps, the disparities in need on campus were already existing before the pandemic. And so that's important for us. We all recognize that every day. This all was happening before, but we're taking it a little bit more advantage of being able to increase our food distribution and visibility of our food resource, because it used to be in the basement of this same building. And I think I'm not going to go next. One of the things when I think about improving, I think of this topic is improving food distribution. I automatically I think my brain's trained to go towards like, oh, storage, like getting things from one place to the other, and like the availability of stuff, like what does the food bank actually have, what are they sourcing? But I also really then have to remind myself, like, but what's actually even more important than that, what we need to talk about more than just our emergency food resource. So our team more and more is going into diving into like, what are our longer term food resources on campus in terms of our students and staff who utilize the pantry. How can they ultimately get a more sustainable source of food and not have to just rely on this emergency resource, which is pretty, it fluctuates. Like what we have available fluctuates a lot. And so that's really important to us. And even above all of that, the most important thing in terms of improving our food distribution has been talking to people that are visiting, that are utilizing the resource itself. So kind of like Tanama mentioned, getting a survey out to figure out what produce to grow. We also want to know what other foods should we be providing? What should we be prioritizing in our pantry? I think food banks prioritize a lot of shelf stable stuff. We asked people, is that really what we should be prioritizing our space, our money, our resources on, or should we be prioritizing more produce, more proteins, and more ready to eat prepared foods? And that's really what people are saying. So we've been shifting to those things just on like the level of like, what are we having as an emergency food resource for people? Those are the main things that people need. And yeah, just going back to some of those root causes, I think Evan's going to talk more about that. So I won't talk too much about that, but really very important beyond just opening up a pantry, emergency food resource to be accessible to everyone is figuring out like, maybe everyone should be paid more so that they, or before that, getting CalFresh are some of the other food resources, but yeah, I'm rambling, so I'm going to go to my next slide. I wanted to talk a little bit about the data, and there's a lot of evidence that need was growing before the pandemic. We actually don't have a lot of data right now based of like increased food insecurity or housing insecurity during COVID-19. I think a lot of people have been asking me that, and I don't know because there hasn't been a lot of research done yet, but some of the data on campus from before, just a little bit of what I pulled here is actually from the My Experience survey. So that's something that campus put out in 2019. And out of everyone who responded, all students, all staff, all faculty, 1 in 4 people were food insecure or reported being food insecure. And then just looking at some of the disparities, like 2 in 5 undergraduates. So if you just pull undergraduates, it increases already the number of people who are food insecure. And then in terms of Latinx and Chicanx respondents, so that includes students and staff, 1 in 2 were food insecure. And then 69% of system impacted undergrads and only 1% of faculty. So it's just like, this is a huge, huge gap. And it's something so basic as food. And then when we look at housing too, there are pretty big disparities. A lot of people don't necessarily think about our postdocs on campus, so I kind of like to highlight the housing insecurity in that population. And then our undergraduates with dependents, people with kids going back to school, 71% were housing insecure in 2019. And then some of the work that our team at the Basic Needs Center has been working on recently is this correlation of food and housing insecurity and then health. And so you can see here just how students that have experienced these insecurities report much poorer health ratings. And so that's something that we really, really need to address. And they talk a little bit about that in the My Experience survey as well, because there is reporting on anxiety and depression from that survey as well. And the disparities are huge when we look at these things. So before I talk about, a little bit of what I think we can do about all of this. This is just a little bit of data specific to our staff on campus. It's not recognized enough that there are staff who work specifically on our food distribution at like our dining halls, making food on campus, and also custodian teams who don't get paid enough to live and eat. And I'm really passionate about it because it's just something that is being ignored. People know about it. I think our campus leadership knows about it, but aren't doing anything that could change it, like raising wages. And so the rates of homelessness, food insecurity, housing insecurity are so much higher even than our undergrads. So I think you can't really read it very well, but it's like 53% housing insecurity among staff in RSSP dining, and then 70% when you take together very low and low food insecurity. Okay, so this is my last slide. I really love this photo. It's some of our student staff. Some of the things that have happened with COVID are we're able to increase the number of student staff that we pay to support their food resources and our basic needs center resources on campus. So we went from having just 1 student staff when the pantry first opened to now having 8 paid student staff. And that's really important. I think there's all of these reasons why paying people for the labor they do is important. I think a lot of people touched on this already. And that, I think that needs to continue. I hope we can ultimately pay everyone who's working at our emergency food resource. And the next thing, or last little thing that happened with COVID, the Basic Needs Center was able to really connect more with some of the other departments on campus, and working super closely with financial aid has proven essential beyond just food, but in supporting other students' basic needs, connecting with University Health Services too. And so this relationship building with the rest of the people on campus is so important, but I think even beyond that is building relationships with off-campus entities too, with off-campus communities, everybody who lives right around our campus. This is something that doesn't seem to happen that often, but I really hope to keep doing. So with that, I'll pass it off to a partner of ours who is off campus, Evan at Berkeley Food Network.
Awesome, thank you. Cool. All right, I'll just share my screen. All right. Cool. All right. Well, thank you, Natalia, Laney. Thank you, the organizers, Tim. My name is Evan. I'm the Research and Advocacy Manager at Berkeley Food Network. It's a real pleasure to be a part of this conference and share with you all. So BFN is a food hub that gets food to people who need it through our on-site pantry, as well as distributions to several dozen partner organizations around Berkeley. We serve an estimated 20,000 people a month with supplementary food, triple the number we were serving pre-pandemic. I'm going to focus on the idea of resilience to crisis and what cities can do about it. There are 2 big points I want to make to both sort of problematize the framing of these concepts and to suggest some passive action. And rather than focus mostly on what BFN does, I'm going to focus on more like the gaps in food conversations I've been noticing from BFN's vantage point, and definitely echoing some of what's already been said. But before going further, I want to also do a quick poll. So in the chat, tell me what you think drives food insecurity. Just take 30 seconds and throw some ideas out there. Racism, systemic racism, settler colonialism, great. Capitalism, white supremacy, poverty, rooted in structural injustice. Cool. Cool, I'll give it a couple more seconds. Capitalism, great. Nice, okay, good group. I am preaching to the choir then, but still think it'll be important to hammer home sort of these ideas. So, so first, resilience to crisis. This gets to the heart of a bigger problem I see in both public health and agri-food conversations around food insecurity. We often prioritize food-related solutions. So more food, better food access, healthier food, better food logistics, food education. And these are all very, very important to think about. But this hyper-focus on food, I think, can be a problem, as if food itself contains the complete answer to food insecurity. So big hunger institutions, as they're referred to, like Feeding America, kind of peripherally acknowledges issues like poverty and steep medical bills, but they continue to advocate for, honestly, the Band-Aid initiatives, more the feel-good programs like health and wellness, reinforcing the reliance on nonprofits. And again, these are all sort of important and necessary right now, but they're just a slice of the story, as you all seem to know. And it all relies on big ag, charity, and volunteers instead of people and communities having more wealth and power for themselves in the first place. The mainstream hunger orgs rarely frame their initiatives and reports around a serious engagement with the pervasive socioeconomic injustices that drive food insecurity for 40 million people in the US, and the egregious disparities all these problems produce. So we will always need, some sort of network of free food distribution organizations, but the concept of in need has become taken for granted in a way, as if poverty is this natural fluctuating phenomenon, when its enormous extent is the result of purposeful political choices over time. So when we talk about crisis and resilience, all of these represent a state of chronic crisis for so many people, including so many of the people we serve at BFN, which we know anecdotally and also through a lot of surveys and interviews we're doing. So true socioeconomic resilience, true food security initiatives must seek to address these massive injustices. According to the formal definition of food insecurity, if BFN, which is an independent nonprofit, were able to consistently provide the total caloric and diet requirements of everyone in need in Berkeley for free, all those people would no longer be definitionally food insecure. So given all these pervasive injustices and the lack of autonomy in being the constant recipient of aid, I think this represents a fundamental flaw in the way food insecurity is understood and how solutions are conceived. So one idea for a path forward would be to throw some of the energy here and in other powerful food spaces behind campaigns for economic, housing, land, and racial justice efforts totally unrelated to food. With greater wealth, time, resources, and stability, communities don't need bigger hunger institutions as much, don't face the chronic crisis as much, and could likely respond in a more agile, community-centric way in times of acute crisis like the pandemic. Okay, second, so cities as the site of growing. Urban farms can be profound sites of socio-political engagement, education, organizing, sharing, resisting, surviving, and indeed feeding people. They're very important. We work with a number of amazing urban farm partners and are so grateful for them. But since they can't supply the entire diet of the city or of the total population BFN serves, as sort of Evan Wig was saying earlier, I think they tend to receive disproportionate attention in urban food circles and especially urban planning spaces with regard to transforming food systems broadly. I think to have truly resilient city spaces, the urban food circles really need to, again, deconstruct this urban-rural binary and build robust, regenerative, cooperative, racially just agricultural systems across bigger swaths of farmland and apply all that pressure of the socio-political organizing, activism, planning, and cooperation we do in cities and on urban farms to what we often think of as this distant countryside. To advocate for radical rural land reform, support cooperative agricultural economics, push for more coordinated regional planning, and fight to redirect subsidies away from monocrops toward regenerative, community-centered agriculture at all scales. And then along with farm subsidies, we really need consistent state and federal funding for food distribution work like ours, so we can rely more on direct purchasing and funded staff, and honestly less on donations and volunteers, again, as grateful and as amazing as those networks are, so that we have more autonomy to shift quickly, again, in these times of acute crisis. So at BFN, we're trying to work along these lines and sort of break outside of the norm of national hunger alleviation programs where you take what's left over from the industrial food system and distribute it to people in need. It'll be an uphill battle, but we're trying to carve out sort of two new spaces in our work. So advocacy, again, for these broader issues, economic, housing, land, and racial justice, and also a new purchasing program. So a lot of food we get is for free, but really purchasing to direct funds to regenerative agriculture, trying to prioritize farmers of color, indigenous farmers, and farmworkers turned farmers, and ideally supporting the emergence of farmer cooperatives that can begin to mount a coordinated challenge to industrial ag. We're working with ALBA, the Agriculture and Land-Based Training Association right now, down in Salinas, training aspiring farmers, farmworkers turned farmers, and are trying to really grow these partnerships. And finally, I just want to say, cooperation is obviously a current running through these ideas, and it's huge for our operations. We coordinate with dozens of partner organizations, and most of them are not food service orgs. They're churches, apartment buildings, schools, nonprofits addressing a range of other issues. So in the same way, I think the food community needs to get more outside food in its networks, particularly in its advocacy and activism, to really tie together causes for justice with a capital J across different issue areas. Cool, I will end there. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks so much, Lainey and Natalia and Evan. I think there's so much to build on here. I mean, in terms of the relationships, the structures to address kind of a holistic sense of basic needs in the short and long term, but then not lose sight of root causes of problems. You know, getting at working towards justice in areas that are broader than food, but also intimately related to the causes of food insecurity. So thanks so much for all of your perspectives. I think we do have a few minutes left for some questions from our participants here. So please share your questions in the chat. I also think these last folks had prepared a few questions for themselves to ask of each other too. So as we wait for questions to come in, if you want to have a bit of that conversation, we can definitely do that. Let me just check the chat here. And also, yeah, please note that our Merit just sent out our evaluation form. We'd really, really like it if you would fill that out in these last few minutes. So, Evan, Lainey, Natalia.
I think we're open to questions from the audience. I think we were thinking we could sort of like collectively tackle them. I actually didn't prepare questions for.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, no, Evan just asked me a great question that really kind of sparked some ideas to share yesterday when we were just checking in about, you know, some of these questions about the purpose of urban farms and contesting the industrial large-scale food system, and thinking about how to really build power to combat that, and you know, talking about rural farm cooperatives and larger pieces of land that often aren't always available in urban centers. But I think it just, like Evan was like, I think I might say something controversial in saying that, you know, urban farms are not going to like take down the food system or like feed all the people or whatever. And I think that just led us into a good chat about the values of education, the values of connecting with the land and having green spaces, and valuing not just the food product that is kind of like a capitalist mindset of like how much food is coming from these farms, but like all the things that they're doing, and having a lot of motivation and support and policy around protecting that. So that was just one of our like kind of questions for ourselves that we wanted to air out a little bit.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, certainly. I think this has been a real theme of how interconnected our cities and rural spaces are, both in terms of flows of food, but also the community connections and the relationships. And we can't think of cities as islands. That's abundantly clear. And we also want to note we have a question for folks. For Evan, what policies are on the horizon that you support? Right, I guess this could go to anybody in terms of this last topic.
I'll just say briefly, there's a couple. We're part of like a Alameda County All-In Eats working group, brings together people across all these different industries to talk. One of the things that's coming out of that is, again, sort of in these peri-urban spaces, rezoning for sort of live-work farm spaces to build housing, and you know, there's policies associated with that, and I'm sorry that I can't remember. But a lot of that's also like a planning process, not necessarily a policy, like rezoning, finding funding, et cetera. But curious what others have to say as well.
And Natalia or Lainey, anything to add there in terms of local policies that?
I was just going to say maybe including urban ag representatives or voices in county planning decision-making bodies. That's something that has been starting to happen in Alameda County that I think is a great development, so that there's not just rural ag from the rural county in the ag commission, there's also urban ag voices and perspectives present, and there's a key like space held for that.
And we'll, sorry, go ahead, Evan.
Oh, I just wanted to, I dropped it in the chat here, but just very recently, the U.S. Department of Agriculture launched a new Office of Urban Agriculture. So there's also a lot happening at the federal level, and I would imagine it'd be a lot more support within the new administration. CAF made a video featuring urban farmers from across California. Basically, it's a virtual video letter to the new Secretary of Agriculture about what that program needs to be and what those federal investments need to be in urban agriculture. So if you want to watch, it's a short video, but it's a really great opportunity to hear directly from a variety and a diversity of urban farmers across California about what they think that department should really be focusing on.
Here, I muted myself. Well, yeah, thanks for sharing that, Evan. I actually just clicked on the link and it started playing, and I had to mute myself real quick. So I'm excited to watch that here in just a minute. Well, with that, we're right at 12, and I want to respect everybody's time. And a huge thank you to our speakers today, and thank you to all of you for coming. I think we have a lot to leave here with, and a lot of calls to action, and how we can work at a lot of different scales. And so, yeah, look forward to, please join us tomorrow for the closing session, and have a good rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Everyone, appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
Take
you.
care.